Hello and welcome to Dotting the Iron Spaceship, a podcast about science fiction and writing. I'm Bob and this is episode 16. This week I'm going to talk about decompression in science fiction, but before that let's get to the weekly roundup. The last couple of weeks have been a bit of a struggle, and last week I wrote a blog post about how it's been hard to get everything done. On Tuesday I wrote a free flash fiction called Final Notice about getting a gravity bill, and I did a review on Wednesday about the game Outer Worlds. My Patreon exclusive flash fiction last week doesn't exist because I started to write a story. I started to write a Frank Mason story and it ended up being 4,000 words. So I haven't quite worked out whether or not I'm going to release that separately or how I'm going to release it. Being that it's 4,000 words, it's not like a typical flash fiction where it doesn't take that long to edit. Because it has a few more moving parts and a few things to catch up to and make sure that, payoffs are set up and set-offs are paid off, that I want to give it sort of a week before I go back and reread everything and, make sure that actually analyze how it's put together and edit it from that kind of a perspective to try and make it a good short story. So it will be being released. It will be free for my Patreon supporters. I just haven't worked out exactly what the timetable is around getting that done. It can really help to put a bit of space between when you actually write the first draft and when you go through and edit it. Normally with flash fiction, I can just you finish writing it, you can go back through it. It's such a small piece, because it's only 500 words, that you're really only trying to do one thing. It doesn't have once you get to 4,000 words, you've got a designated you're starting to push into where you need to actually make sure that the 3-act structure works properly and then make sure that all the necessary components of that story happens. With flash fiction, you can often get away with just telling a single scene, so you don't need to necessarily have all of the, components of a full-length story in a flash fiction. It can just be an individual story. It doesn't even need to necessarily have payoffs and setups. But already looking at it, I can say, here's the part that's the ordinary world, here's the extraordinary world for the story, here's, the development of the character that I'm doing, have I made sure that the stuff that the character's doing is properly introduced and not, easily understandable. Anyway, so it needs to be edited from a more technical perspective than I can normally get away with the short stories. So it will exist, it will come out. It's a story called Crash. But yeah, it just turned out that I started writing a story that I wanted to write and it got out of hand. So like I said, it's been a pretty difficult couple of weeks. I don't know whether it's necessarily just the change in daylight savings, which happened a couple of weeks ago. That always sort of throws me out of sorts because it shifts my sleeping pattern, and my sleeping pattern is pretty fragile. I'm also working 6 days this week, and I knew that was going to come, so I had a higher stress level last week when I wasn't working as much because they just sort of moved which days of my weekend. And although it sounds like I haven't really been getting much done while I was at work, I was listening to, I think, 7 of the Walt Longmire mysteries on audiobook, and I re-listened to The Maltese Falcon last week. I've been trying to really get my head into detective story mode to sort of pick up on all of those tropes that are normally, the necessary conventions that are put into a detective story, and how the structure of a detective story works, and the turn when the detective solves the case is a pretty important part of a detective story. So trying to get my head around that. So I've been focusing on detective stories so much that I think that has also made it a little bit harder to get my head into a different gear to be writing the regular stuff. But that's definitely something that I've got to keep working on. And it's true with the lack of sleep and the general morose that I've been feeling lately, that I've let resistance get the better of me and let computer games be the procrastination tool of choice. of like, oh no, I'll just for a couple of minutes, I'll just play this computer game, and then it's 6 hours later. So I know that I've got to get work done, and I've made a plan. As it's probably quite clear to anyone who's listened to all of the episodes, I make a lot of plans. But I've made a plan that I'm not going to play computer games unless I've got my work done for the day. If I don't have my work done for the day, then I'm not going to be like, oh well, because what happens a lot is I'll get up and I'll be like, oh well, I'm gonna have breakfast and I'm still waking up, and that's gonna take a little while. So I'll play computer games for an hour or so, just while I'm waking up and sort of getting back into the day, and then that ends up being a huge amount of time, and I don't look at the clock, and soon it's the next day and I haven't got any work done. So I need to be more wary of that, and for a while after, it's like over the last 2 months, I pretty much stopped playing computer games completely until the last sort of couple of weeks, because when you're making time to do all this writing stuff and creative stuff, that doesn't leave a lot of time outside of that. So I just naturally haven't really been playing, even though the games are installed on my computer. They haven't been getting much purchase. So, except for this weekend, the last couple of weeks, I've sort of, I don't know, just feeling the burn. I mean, I've been talking about it for the last couple of weeks in my blogs and podcasts about being worried about burnout. And this isn't really burnout as such, it's just sort of a slight pause. I wasn't feeling great, and so I took any excuse to run away and hide in a hole. But I'm feeling a bit better this week and getting back into it and refocusing on the goal. And one thing that sort of helps me bring back into focus of what I should be getting done is the people who've been helping me out on Patreon. So I just want to say a big thank you to the people who have helped me out on Patreon. If you become a patron on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or $1 US a month, you can get access to 17 currently Patreon exclusive stories. So you get access to stuff which nobody else has access to, which you can then brag to all your friends. You also get your name on the Heraldic List of Awesome, which is the page on my website which constantly says thank you to my patrons, and of course acknowledges the King of Awesome, who is the first amongst my patrons, the person who has proven to be the most awesome fan of my work. And the King this week, as it has been for all the weeks of the podcast, is Seven Art. Thank you so much to Seven Art for supporting me and helping me to do art things. I know I don't talk about a lot of the time, but it's not free to do what I'm doing. It costs money to have the website hosted, it costs money to have the podcast hosted, it costs money for the music that I use, I have to pay a license fee for. So I want to make it good. I want to make the stuff that I'm putting out good and high quality, and that costs money. It isn't free. So thank you to the people that are helping me to afford to be able to do that. But if you can't help me pay for these bills that I have, you can help me increase the number of the range that I'm getting. I've had a fair number of downloads of the podcast already, and it's only been public for a couple of weeks. So thank you very much to my listeners, which is apparently overwhelmingly French people. So bonjour, French people who are listening to the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that my accent isn't so horrendous that it offends you. So if you can't help me out by supporting me on Patreon, you can definitely help me out by spreading the word and telling people who might like a podcast about science fiction and writing about it, and telling people about my website and about the stories and reviews that are on there and whether or not they're any good. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for reading my short stories and reviews and blogs and things. But let's get into the main topic for today. So the main topic today is about decompression in movies. There's a couple of pretty egregious tropes that happen around scenes where decompression is involved. Seems like people pretty much didn't do any research at all about how it would actually work, and so we get some pretty outrageous scenes in popular culture So probably one of the most egregious is the scene from Total Recall, where they get blown out of the colony and then their faces explode into these massive bulbous monstrosities, and then the air comes back and they just sort of heal incredibly quickly. That's apparently there's no damage to your face exploding and then being recompressed, or immediate death, from what would be the bends. I don't know. It really just haven't. They clearly didn't consult anyone who understands how pressure works. So before we get into some of the more egregious examples of it in pop culture, the first thing that I want to do is go through what would actually happen in the real world if, there was a hole in a spaceship or the decompression in a plane. So commonly when there is any kind of decompression in movies, it's typically explosive decompression, which is where, the hole in the ship is large enough that the air is rushing out at the speed of sound, and it rushes out very quickly, and it's quite violent, and it throws with it people and debris. So explosive decompression is a thing that really does happen, but it doesn't usually happen the way that it does happen in movies. If you're in a plane and a window is broken, and this it happens every now and again. It does still happen. But in 2018, there was a woman died when a piece of the engine, I think there was metal fatigue in one of the rotors, and a piece of the engine broke out. One of the rotors broke out, and it hit the window and shattered the window, and basically the window was gone. And decompression was really quick. There was debris flying everywhere. The woman who died was unfortunately pulled out of her, as far as I understand, her torso was pulled out of the plane, and she was held in place by the seatbelt. The people around her were able to grab her and pull her back, and unfortunately, she died due to blunt force trauma of the debris hitting her. She didn't die due to the decompression, which, obviously there are other people who are able to be, conscious and awake and unharmed to pull her back into the plane. And it's an unfortunate story, but I wanted to really highlight that in the real world, explosive decompression is something that you can survive pretty easily, even though in a plane it doesn't decompress all the way down to vacuum. Even in that case, you only require excess oxygen. It's like being at high altitude on a mountain. And the danger around explosive decompression isn't the decompression, it's the debris that gets picked up and thrown around, which is, can be deadly. Which is why on planes they tell you to, protect your head with your arms, and get sort of crawl down into a ball if things happen. That's to protect you from debris. There's not more air closer to the ground or anything in a plane. So in a plane is probably the most common place where we'll see rapid decompression in real life. But of course, the International Space Station is going to be a reoccurring example, I suppose, throughout this discussion of what would happen in the case of the ISS if there was a problem. So, firstly, there was actually a problem in 2018 again. In December 2018, they discovered a hole in the ISS that was slowly letting out some air. No one was overly concerned about it. They went out, they did an EVA, they had a look at it. It turns out someone accidentally drilled a hole in it and then didn't notice. So that should tell you that if the hole is proportionally small to the volume of air that's inside the vessel, how even a small hole doesn't really make much of a difference. Now, initially they thought that it was a hole caused by a micrometeorite, and then, when they showed photos of it, you can clearly see that it was damage done by a drill. Someone must have been doing some repairs, made a mistake. They don't even, they know when they noticed the oxygen problem, but the drill hole could have actually happened before that and then been blocked by something, and then that thing finally, was dislodged for some reason. So they don't even know when the hole was made. So it was a relatively tiny hole. It looks like a 3 or 4 mil bit. I don't know exactly the size. Like from the photos, it's hard to tell, but it is easy to tell that it's a small hole. But it does get you thinking to sort of what would happen in the case of a hole in the ISS. How big does it need to be very dangerous? What's a dangerous amount? So there's a rule of thumb. It's like there's a lot of maths around how quickly the air will move. So the air is basically moving at the speed of sound. That's how sound works, right? You vibrate some air, the air hits other air just because it's naturally moving, and then it moves out. So the fastest speed that gas will move if it's pressurized at sort of sea level pressure is the speed of sound. Obviously, if it's denser and at higher pressure, it will move quicker. Also, as the pressure is relieved, as it's dropping, it doesn't move at a linear rate. It will drop off I think it's an exponential fall as it approaches becoming pressure equalized with the outside, which in the case of the ISS is virtually zero. It actually, at 450 kilometers high where the ISS is, there is actually atmosphere outside the ship, but it's negligible from the point of view of trying to breathe it or wander around in it. It's very low, but it is actually something that they need to take account of because it does slightly slow the ISS down. Without you need to actually use thrusters to reposition the ISS occasionally so that it doesn't slow down and fall back to Earth and burn up. If there was no one on it and there wasn't any remote controls for the ISS, eventually it would fall back to Earth because it's not far enough away where it's not getting slowed down by the atmosphere that is around it. But for the point of this conversation about decompression, we can assume that outside the ISS is a true vacuum, at least for the purposes of the thought experiment. So there's a metric for like how quickly the pressure will drop, and so a 1 square centimeter hole in a 1 cubic meter volume will cause the pressure to drop by a factor of 10 in roughly 100 seconds. So in 100 seconds, the pressure will basically go from the pressure of Earth to around the pressure of Mars in about 100 seconds. Now that's pretty quick, but if you've got, 100 seconds is nearly 2 minutes. So you'd have a fairly decent amount of time to be able to do something about it, either stop the blockage or protect yourself by getting some extra oxygen, or a number of other things. Yeah, you have a lot of choice actually at that metric. Well, where like I said, it's not a linear relationship, so a 2 square centimeter hole in a cubic meter volume will actually rush air out slightly faster than 50 seconds. From the point of view of getting our heads around how decompression works in spaceships, we can just use this as a rule of thumb, just assume that it's a linear relationship. And so from that, if there was a 1 centimeter hole in the ISS, it would take 25.4 hours for the ISS, the volume of the ISS is about 915 cubic meters of air, which is approximately the same actually as a 747. It would take 25.4 hours for the ISS to drop down to 1/10 the volume of the using the same metric in sort of the other way. How quickly would it take the ISS to evacuate its air in approximately 100 seconds? You would need a hole that's about 30 by 30 centimeters, so 915 squared centimeters would drop the pressure of the ISS in less than 2 minutes. Now, to be clear, less than 2 minutes is still not, it's rapid decompression, but it's actually not explosive decompression, in that the air in that case is still being restricted, the pressure still being restricted, and so it wouldn't actually be at the speed of sound. It would be slower than that. It'd still be like if the ISS, if you had 915 cubic meters of air suddenly leave the ISS, it would be pretty disorienting, and there would definitely be stuff getting thrown around, and it would get really cold, and it wouldn't be very nice. But it wouldn't be sucking anyone out of the craft and ruining their day. It would just be, we probably should do something about this relatively quickly. And I mean, I don't know for sure, but I do know that NASA trains for pretty much everything that could happen, and so I'm fairly certain that they would have trained for a massive hole to form in the ISS and for them to be able to deal with it. But explosive decompression that they wouldn't be able to do anything about, that would potentially, explosive decompression, it would knock you over. It wouldn't necessarily suck you out into space, but you would need a hole that was almost 3 meters by 3 meters. You basically need if the ISS snapped in half, then it would have explosive decompression in both of the half sections. But outside of a hole that large, like literally a module being ripped off, you're not going to get explosive decompression where there's even a chance. Like the 30 by 30 centimeter hole, so that's a huge hole in the ISS, still leaves you enough time to actually close, some, like where the ISS is put together, where the modules are put together, there are points where you can actually close off whole modules. So you could still just sort of run up to that section and manually close the door, and then you're probably fine. And that's assuming that the amount of air in the ISS is static, which is a poor assumption because the ISS has tanks of gas, or the liquid, but tanks of liquefied gas that it can push out into the atmosphere to keep pressure. So in the case of the hole that was drilled in the ISS, it wasn't even a problem. Like it's a problem, obviously, if there's stuff leaving the ISS, it's a problem because they want to have as closed a system as possible, because everything on the ISS has to be taken up in orbit. It costs money to do that. Every kilogram of stuff that goes into low Earth orbit costs thousands of dollars. So every little bit that you lose is costing you money, and that's money that you could be using to send, science experiments up instead of maintaining the station. So it's not that it's not, a problem at all, but it's not a big problem that there was this small hole in the ISS that was where the air was dropping, because they have enough backup liquid gas that they can push out into this station to keep the station's pressure for a long period of time. So even a centimeter hole, it would take a lot longer than 25 hours for it to drain those tanks, as well as the 915 cubic meters of air that they keep on that's the volume of the station. So with all that said, let's talk about how it is portrayed in movies a lot of the time. So one of the worst scenes in all of pop culture history when it comes to decompression is the climax of Total Recall. So in the climax of Total Recall, there's a tussle, there's this bomb, the bomb goes off, it blows a hole in the wall of this colony. Now the colony, for some reason, doesn't have any emergency structures that cut off the section where the hole is in it, which is clearly a problem in the design of the colony. But basically there's a lot of air outside of the colony, the volume, all of the volume of the colony is able to go past this hole, and it creates so much pressure that it literally lifts Arnold Schwarzenegger off of the ground and pulls him towards the hole that's now formed. Now the hole in the wall, whilst the hole in the wall is portrayed as being sort of several meters in diameter, in comparison to the volume of the whole colony, which is now going through. So it takes 3 minutes of this continuous explosive decompression that seems to be happening in the scene, where they're literally then sucked out onto the surface of Mars. So that isn't good. If the hole was large enough in comparison to the total volume of the colony in order to cause explosive decompression, the pressure would be equalized very quickly. There's no way that the the explosive decompression can be maintained for multiple minutes. I mean, if you're on a plane and the window gets ripped out, it's going to take maybe 20 seconds at the longest for the entire volume of the plane to be evacuated. Now, a colony is going to be a lot larger in volume than a plane, but if the hole in the colony, like that's shown in Total Recall, would have formed like around it, there might be enough, like the pressure change would be a problem where it could potentially pull you out when you got close to the hole. But the further you go away from the hole, the less the pressure is going to change, because you're pulling on a larger and larger area, volume around the hole that's pushing into it. So it's I don't know, there's probably an R-squared law that's used to work all of this stuff out that I'm not going to research for this. But after Arnie gets pulled out onto the surface of Mars, his face slowly grows and his eyes form this, tangerine sized. They're like pulled out by their stalks. It's a very gruesome scene, and it's entirely not what would happen if you were to suddenly be exposed without a suit on Mars. Your face would not grow to be 3 times the size. And then, I mean, in the movie they activate this button that adds gas pressure to Mars using what we can only assume is magic, because it adds gas pressure to Mars so quickly that they're fine, as opposed to the amount of gas involved that would be involved in adding that amount of gas to Mars to be able to create sufficient pressure to then not die if you're on the outside of Mars. That would take a very long time. You couldn't do it in 30 seconds or 3 minutes, whatever. Actually, though, they're being pulled for quite a while in that scene before he hits the go button for that. So, anyway, it's a monstrous scene because it has not only this sort of continuous explosive decompression that never ever ends, but it also has human decompression as a thing that's a really dangerous thing. So, the point to be made about human decompression is there's 14 pounds per square inch pressure on your skin right now, and if you go into space, there isn't that. Now, that's a problem if you've got your mouth open, but the skin is designed to hold against that pressure. So in the absence of that pressure, the skin is pulling out, but it's not going to expand to 3 times the size. And to highlight that point, every 10 meters vertically down you go underwater, you increase the pressure on the human body, or on the pressure of anything, by 1 atmosphere. So 14 pounds per square inch. So if you swim 10 meters down, if you're a scuba diver and you swim under 10 meters of water, you add 1 atmosphere of pressure onto your body. So whilst recreational scuba divers don't go down that far, or they can go down 10 meters, and in fact, depending on the country that you live in and the body that sort of describes it, usually divers don't go like scuba divers. If you're just a recreational diver, you probably won't go below 30 meters, and I think the Recreational Scuba Training Council says to not go below 40 meters. But even below 40 meters of air, you're currently, so you've got the full atmosphere at the surface of the water that you would experience. For every 10 meters, you get 1 more atmosphere. And so at 40 meters down, at the limit of what you could do if you were just a random diver, you would then have 5 atmospheres of pressure on your body. Now, the limit for Navy divers and things to go down is pretty far, and I think the world record for the deepest dive of scuba is 332 meters. 332 meters means that guy's under 34 atmosphere pressures on his body in a wetsuit. So that's a lot of pressure. That would be really hard to breathe. But that's why they use, as you go down deeper, you're not. So obviously with scuba diving, you're breathing tanked air, but it's not just tanked air. Like I haven't just compressed it into air, so you've got air. The deeper that you're going, they use different concentrations of gas to to help you be able to breathe more efficiently. And they use these different mixes, so they increase the amount of oxygen, they decrease the amount of nitrogen, they do different things. They put in other drugs, I think, to make it work better in your lungs. I'm not an expert on what they use in scuba diving. I just know that they use different oxygen and nitrogen mixes based on the depth that you're planning to go, and that there are special mixes that they use for experimental Navy dives and stuff. So what I'm saying is, going from 1 atmosphere to 0 atmospheres is not as big as the gap that a recreational diver could do just by going 20 meters to the surface. So any scuba diver has gone through a larger decompression than any atmospheric loss could possibly sustain, because they've already lost twice as much pressure to get back to the 1. So going from 1 to 0, not a huge pressure loss. Your body's not going to rapidly expand and explode. So exploding in space, not going to be a thing. Freezing in space, technically a thing. Like, eventually you will freeze to death in space, because your heat can go away. But even with that, that's often shown as being quite considerably faster than it would be. If you walk into a freezer, say, you can get cold, right? Because the air is cold. It's cold air is touching you. It's taking heat from your body and taking it out. In the case of being in vacuum, there's no mechanism to remove the heat from your body except for the loss of radiation. So in that case, it would actually take considerably longer to lose your heat in space than is often shown. They often show you freeze immediately. So there was a movie, Mission to Mars. Guy, the climax, the guy takes his helmet off. He dies straight away, which is weird because even without oxygen, So let's say in that case, let's take that example. You take off your space helmet in space, as opposed to taking it off in atmosphere. You'd be fine if you did that. But you take off your helmet in space. What would happen? Well, for the first 10-15 seconds, nothing would change. Potentially, you could do some damage to your lungs if you tried to hold in your breath. If you breathe out and then take your helmet off, you're probably not going to see any damage at all if you put your helmet back on in the first 10 seconds. And you might lose consciousness after 15 seconds, but if someone grabbed you and pulled you back into the spaceship within the first 2 minutes and got air back into you, it's just like holding your breath. You probably wouldn't see any real concerns. You'd see some damage to your capillaries, soft tissue, so you might see a little bit of lung damage, a little bit of damage. Your eyes might go bloodshot, or those areas that are quite soft tissue in your body could potentially be damaged due to the decompression. You might end up with black fingers as the skin around your fingers is damaged. But in most cases, 2 minutes in hard vacuum would not be a problem at all. You certainly wouldn't freeze to death in 2 minutes. You would, the air has run away, the water has run away on the skin. You wouldn't get a sheen of ice, which is quite common that they show in movies. Especially in that Mission to Mars, he freezes immediately. Your eyeballs aren't going to freeze in 2 minutes. They're going to hold. Water doesn't lose energy very quickly. It already doesn't lose energy very quickly in atmosphere. Outside of atmosphere, it's going to hold on to it even longer. So there's a scene in, I forget what episode it is in Enterprise. It's in the first season of Enterprise. It's called Shuttle 1 or something like that. It's got just Malcolm and Trip. The whole episode is focused around them thinking they've been left for dead. There's micro wormholes or something that tears a hole in the ship, and they lose air. That scene where there's a hole in the ship, there's actually multiple holes in the ship. They run around, they're looking for it, they're trying to figure it out. The holes aren't large enough to be a huge problem. in that they're not going to lose atmosphere very quickly, but it turns out one of the holes actually goes through their emergency air tanks, so they're pretty concerned about it because that massively reduces the amount of air that they're going to have available. But they run around the ship, they're trying to find the thing, they use gas, like they put a bit of gas out so that they can visually see where it's being like drawn into space, and then they literally just put their fingers over the holes, because if you put your finger over a hole in space, your skin, like I said, when you go down 10 meters underwater, it's not like your skin tears off, like, so your skin can deal with being in zero pressure or low pressure without there really being much of a problem. So they put their fingers over that. I think they seal the hole. So they have an epoxy that they use long term, but I think short term they seal the hole with a bit of mashed potato, which is it's one of my favorite episodes of Enterprise. Watching that scene, because it really does show that holes in space is a problem, but it's not as big a problem as they often show in movies where, oh my god, explosive decompression could happen or whatever. Similarly, in The Martian, so in the book, Watney's whole face mask gets ripped off and he has to glue a thing onto it, and so they've got an emergency epoxy that they use, and he cuts I think in the book he cuts the arm off of his space suit and then puts his arm into the body of the suit and seals the armhole completely up, and then he uses that extra fabric from the armhole to seal the visor hole, and then he just sort of has to wander around not being able to see. I think he even uses a camera in the book to run around. In the movie with Matt Damon, the whole of the space visor isn't damaged, it's just cracked, and he just paints it up with duct tape, which would work, at least in the short term. For the purposes that Watney needs to get from one place to another, it would work fine. So that's a really good example of using sort of how decompression is definitely something that you should be thinking about if you're working in space, but it's not something that's such a problem that you wouldn't be able to do anything. And in fact, in the 4,000 word story that I wrote, Crash, which hasn't been published yet, but there's a scene where Frank Mason is exposed to vacuum, and because he lives in space, he's always wearing an emergency spacesuit. So the way that those spacesuits work, there's basically those jackets that have a hood that's folded up into the collar. So it's like that, but the collar, when you pull it out, the hood goes all the way over his face, and then the zip is used to seal it up again. And he has the same thing around his hands, and his feet were already enclosed. So in the case of an emergency space problem, he always is wearing enough to seal himself up and be protected from that and be able to get to safety. So to vastly increase that, you've got that 10 seconds. If you're in hard vacuum, you've got that 10 seconds. But even in the case of there being a hole in the ship, you've got time before hard vacuum where you're going to be conscious as well. So, let's say there's a hole in Frank's ship, he's got, some time, as well as some time after it's a complete vacuum, where he's going to be conscious and got enough time to put on this emergency suit and then be able to try and find safety after that. So the longer you can increase the amount of time that you're going to be conscious after a problem, the more likely you're going to be able to fix it. So that's sort of the idea that I had around that. Anyhow, so pretty much decompression in movies can be done well. It's often done terribly. Actually, just on it being done well, The Expanse does decompression and does just space in general. The Expanse does very well. There's a scene in, I don't remember, episode 6 or one of the early scenes of the episodes where that young kid's uncle, when you first see him, he opens his visor, is in space, he breathes out, there's some wire that's sparking or something, and he breathes out, opens the mask up, grabs it, deals with it, closes the mask and repressurizes the suit, which is a really cool scene from the perspective of a space nerd like me, because I'm like, you could do that, that would be really cool. It's definitely not something that you would want to become blasé about, which is sort of what they're showing, because the belters in the Expanse have lived in space for generations. They're not blasé, but they're sort of so used to the dangers of space that nothing really phases them. But it is a really cool scene, seeing a dude just open his mask up and not explode like Total Recall. Anyhow, definitely, if you're going to write decompression scene in space, you should do some basic Google search. Please do some basic Google research. It's not that hard to find. So let's move on to next week. So my Tuesday story, the prompt for my Tuesday story next week is robots need not apply. I don't know what I'm going to do with that, but it seemed fitting, being that the TV show that I'll be reviewing on Wednesday is going to be Star Wars The Phantom Menace. And in fact, every week for the next 9 weeks, every Wednesday, the movie that I'll be reviewing will be the Star Wars movie. So it's the 9-week countdown between now and when the final Star Wars in inverted commas Skywalker saga is ending, and we'll get to my view on the Skywalker saga, I'm sure, as we get closer to the new movie coming out. Because personally, I think Disney Star Wars stands very separate to the first 6 George Lucas Star Wars episodes. But I mean, in 9 weeks, I could be surprised. My Thursday story for next week is from a prompt called Baby Bomb, and I haven't worked out what I'm going to do with that either. And the topic for next week's podcast is explosions in space. So after listening to me blather on in a really random fashion for the last however long minutes during this podcast, are there any really egregious examples other than Total Recall? I mean, there are so many. There's some pretty bad examples in pop culture of decompression being done pretty poorly, and I think Total Recall really exemplifies a lot of them. It's a iconic scene that a lot of people saw because it was in a mainstream film. But what do you think? Was there an example that I should be talking about that's outside of that horrible scene from Total Recall? Was there a scene from something other than The Expanse or The Martian that did decompression really well? I'd love to hear from you, and if you want to contact me, you can message me at contact@robert-lynch.com or on Twitter @BobLynchBSC. If you like what I do and you want to help me keep doing it, you can become a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/RobertLynch. As always, check out my website for new stuff every weekday, and I will see you next week.